Thanks for taking the time to come to this voter registration training. My name is Elizabeth Grieser. I'm the operations manager for the League of Women Voters in Metropolitan Columbus. And tonight we're going to go through some basic voter registration rules and Ohio laws. And this training is going to be specific to the second primary of 2022, which is going to be August 2nd. And we're going to talk about various different things. We're going to talk about first who can vote. We'll go through the various forms that you will need if you're doing voter registration and voter outreach, either for the League of Women Voters or on your own or with another organization. So first we'll go over the hard copy paper forms. Then we'll talk about online voter registration and how to verify voter registrations online. Then we'll move into how to help people request absentee ballots and the different voting options that you have here in Ohio, which are in person, absentee by mail, or early in person. And then we'll talk a little bit about what is going to be on the upcoming August 2nd primary election and how you can help people find their districts, which we have new districts now in place for 2022, and how you can help them find if they have something to vote on in the upcoming election or not. So, we get a little bit ahead. So who can vote? To vote in Ohio, you must be a US citizen. You must be an Ohio resident 30 days by election day. That is in the statute. However, in practicality, it doesn't really mean that much because the voter registration deadline in Ohio is also 30 days before the election. So if you move to Ohio the day before the registration deadline and you register to vote, you will have been an Ohio resident for 30 days by election day. You must be 18 by election day, and that's especially important when it comes to the primary election because the election day that the statute refers to is actually the general election date, which this year is November 8th. So voters can vote in a primary if they are 17 and will be 18 by the November 8th election. So if someone is 17 and their birthday is in October, they can go ahead and get registered to vote right now, and they can vote in the August 2nd primary for primary election races. They cannot vote on issues that will be decided by the August 2nd election, if that makes sense. So if there was a levy on the August 2nd ballot, a school levy for Upper Arlington, and there's no such levy, I'm just using this as an example. If you were 17, you would not be able to vote for this levy because that issue will be finally decided at the end of the August 2nd election. One of the most important points that I like to cover on who can vote is that people who have a past felony conviction on their record can still vote in Ohio. So as long as you are not currently serving time for a felony, you are allowed to vote. The caveat being that if you were in jail for a felony conviction, you will have to re-register to vote once you're released from jail. And there can be quite a bit of confusion over this because different states have different rules. And in some states, if you have a felony conviction on your record, you lose your right to vote in that state forever. But that's not the case in Ohio. And we have some specific handouts about this that you can hand out if you're doing a voter registration drive with us, if someone has any questions about that. There's a couple other special populations I wanted to touch on in terms of specific issues you might want to consider when registering. So for transient or homeless individuals, they often register using the address of a homeless shelter that they frequent or a local community organization or church that will accept mail on their behalf. When you are registering these individuals, you want to ask them their preferred address and make sure that that is a location that they can get back to easily, either to get mail, to mail in their absentee ballot if that's how they choose to vote, or just to get their mail to receive the verification that they have been registered to vote. You may also want to talk to them about their voting plans. So the ID requirement can be a bit prohibitive for individuals who are transient or homeless. Some don't have driver's license or a state ID that is required when you go vote on election day. If you vote early in person or you vote absentee by mail, you don't have to have that hard copy ID. You can just use your date of birth or the last 4 digits of your social. So this could be easier for someone who is homeless, as long as they have a location that they can easily get their mail from, and they have access to getting stamps and things like that. So just bringing up these various points can be helpful if you are registering individuals who are homeless. And then finally, registering college students, they also have several interesting details when it comes to registering. They can choose whether they like to register at their campus address or at their parents' or family's address. It's their choice, whichever they consider to be their permanent home. So if someone is going to Ohio State and their family lives up in Cuyahoga County, they can choose to register either in Franklin County or Cuyahoga, and they can make that decision before every election. So they can kind of flip-flop around if they want to, but they can't be registered in both places. Their driver's license does not need to match the address where they are registered. So if their driver's license lists their parents' address, they don't have to have their campus dorm address on their driver's license. And a question that sometimes comes up is whether their financial aid or in-state versus out-of-state status might be impacted by voting in Ohio. And the answer is no. If you're registered to vote in Ohio, but your permanent residence, your parents live in Pennsylvania, that does not affect the in-state versus out-of-state, tuition and financial aid.
Elizabeth, if they change their address back and forth between their parents and their campus address, do they just fill out the change of address portion if they're Ohio residents?
Yeah, it's basically the same form. So they can either go online and just update their address to the Ohio Secretary of State, or they can fill out this form, which I'm going to go through here, before every voter registration deadline if they want to update their address. And if you are in a situation where you will be registering a number of college students, you might want to ask them what their plans are for voting after they've registered. So if they are going to school at Ohio State, but they want to register where their parents live in Cleveland, are they planning to request an absentee ballot, or do they think they're going to be up in Cleveland to do early voting, or do they plan to go up to their parents' house on election day to vote? So just make sure that they're thinking through all those steps that they might need to vote, because it can be a little more complicated if they're registering someplace that they're not going to school. So when I haven't done this training in person for several years, but when I did this training in person, at this point, I would hand out a voter registration form and we would go through it. And I'm doing that now, but just virtually. So I've broken up the form into 3 different slides so that you can read it. But the next 3 slides are all the same 1-page form. And you will use this form to register a person who's never voted before, never registered before. You'll use this form for someone who wants to update their address. And you also use this form for people that want to update their name or, wait, what's the other one? Oh, never mind. Those are the three. Sorry. So new voters, updating address, and updating names, you will use the same form. When you're filling it out, it's fairly simple. But after a voter has completed the form, if you're doing a registration drive, if the voter is willing to stay for a minute while you look it over, that's really helpful because often they either miss questions or what they filled out isn't exactly right. And as long as the voter is still there, they can make changes on the form. But if they've left, you are not allowed to make any changes to the form, even if it's something simple like number one says, are you a US citizen? They leave it blank. You're not allowed to go back and check yes. So this first part of the form is just, your name, your address. You have to include your birth date. And then number 10 is your Ohio driver's license or the last 4 digits of your social. The middle part of the form is where you would update your address. If it's a first-time registrant, they can just leave this section blank. And that's also where you would change your name. And then finally, at the bottom, you want to make sure the voter puts in today's date. You'd be surprised how many times voters put in their birth date. And you also want to make sure that they sign the form within the dotted lines. There's a scanner at the Board of Elections that they use to run all these forms through, and it just takes the signature that's within the dotted line. So that part is important. So we talked about a number of these issues or errors already. One thing we didn't talk about is that voters need to have an actual physical address on the form and not a PO box. And that's because the Board of Elections will assign a polling location based on the physical address. And if they just have a PO box, they aren't able to assign a polling location based on that. Finally, you want to make sure if someone is filling out this hard copy form that they write legibly. The Board of Elections has to process many, many of these forms every year. And if they can't read it, they'll end up either entering it incorrectly because they can't read, what someone's last name is. So maybe they don't end up spelling it right, or they just pitch it because it's so illegible they can't read it. And sometimes the Board of Elections will contact the voter and let them know that they weren't able to process it, and other times not. So it's not a sure thing. If you are doing a voter outreach event and you look over the form and you realize you're having trouble reading it, having the voter maybe rewrite some of it might be a good idea. Okay, so this slide is if you are at a voter outreach drive and you are returning paper registration forms for someone else. They must be returned 10 days after the registration form is completed or by the voter registration deadline. So for the second primary election, the voter registration deadline is July 5th. If you do a voter outreach event on the 4th of July, they have to be returned the next day to the Board of Elections. In Franklin County, the Board of Elections is located on Morse Road. You are allowed to return the forms to the Secretary of State's office downtown as well, but I would highly recommend just returning them to the County Board of Elections office. Those forms can be mailed in or they can be returned in person. If you are a league member and you are volunteering for one of our voter registration drives, you can return completed forms to my house. I live in Worthington and I always have a plastic bin on my front porch. When you sign up for a voter registration drive, I give you all these details and more in a follow-up email. But for league members, you will not have to go to the Board of Elections office. you can just return them to my house and I review them and then make sure they get turned in. So after you've registered someone to vote, you want to let them know what to expect next. The next step is that within 20 business days, so basically 4 weeks after receiving a voter registration form, the Board of Elections will notify you by mail that you are registered, where your precinct is, where your polling location is, and any details about the upcoming election. We covered registering by paper form, but you can also register to vote online as of 2017. The Ohio Secretary of State's website has a really easy to use form. You just go through and enter all the information that we talked about on the hard copy form with your date of birth and the last 4 digits of your social. And you can register online or update your address without having to mail in a form or turn it into the County Board of Elections. This works for most every voter. The voters it will not work for is a voter who does not have a presence in the Ohio state government files. So if you have a voter that just moved here yesterday from Montana and they have never been to Ohio before, have never filed taxes, they don't have a driver's license from Ohio, they've had no interaction with the Ohio government, they will not be able to register online to vote because the online system is going to match the voter profile with other Ohio government departments that the voter has interacted with before. That sometimes comes up, but I would say very rarely, even with young voters, 17 and 8-year-olds, many of them have driver's license or they have filed taxes because they had a summer job or they have a state ID. So if it's not working easily to register a voter online, just go ahead and use the paper form because there are a few voters that this will not work for. So I want to talk a little bit about voter purges. In Ohio, the voter rolls are purged in a somewhat regular way. Our last purge happened in January of 2021. 98,000 Ohioans were taken off of the voter rolls. Because of this, and for a number of other reasons, we always want to verify that everyone's registration is current. And there's a lot of reasons why a voter might be taken off the voter rolls. Either people pass away, people move out of state. So there's the voter purges are a way of kind of cleaning up the voter rolls, although the league always kind of double checks who is being purged from the rolls. And there's often a number of mistakes, people that were purged but weren't supposed to be purged. So that is a great reason to make sure when you're doing a voter registration event that everyone's registration is current. And this is how you do that. You can go to the Secretary of State's website, and it's a very simple form. You just put in the first name, last name, and the county. Once you do that, let's say, for example, I put in my own name, Elizabeth Reeser, and I live in Franklin County. There is only one Elizabeth Reeser living in Franklin County, so my name will come up and there'll be an address underneath. What you'll want to do is, check that address with the voter. Say, oh, do you live at 123 Main Street? And if the voter says yes, they're all set, they're registered, and they don't need to do anything. If the voter says, I used to live there a couple of years ago, but I've since moved, that means they're registered, but at an old address. So they need to update their address, which they can do either online or with the hard copy form. And if nothing comes up, if I put my name and nothing comes up, that means that they're not in the system. They need to register to vote. This generally works pretty well. I would say that the hardest part about using this system is if you have a very common name. So if you have, let's say your name is John Smith and you live in Franklin County, there's going to be a number of John Smiths that come up. But often there's just a couple different names that come up and you'll be able to easily sort that out. When the league does voter registration events, we have a big QR code that we put on our table where voters can scan the QR code. It takes them directly to the site and they can do the lookup themselves if they wish. Okay, so moving on to voting options for 2022, and this is specific for the August election. When you're talking to voters, you can let them know they can vote on election day, Tuesday, August 2nd, from 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. They can vote early in person at the Board of Elections office starting on July 6th. And this holds true for every county in Ohio. So every county in Ohio, you can go to the Board of Elections office Monday through Friday from 8 to 5, and they have a few additional hours on the last several weekends before Election Day, and you can vote in person early. You could also do an absentee mail-in vote starting July 6th, and your ballot must be postmarked by August 1st to be counted. When we do voter outreach events, we get quite a few questions about absentee ballot applications. I can tell you for sure that the Board of Elections will not be sending out absentee ballot applications for the August election. So if someone wants to vote absentee, they're going to have to fill out an absentee ballot application. And I have a copy of that coming up in the slides so you can see what that looks like. If I already had someone ask me if they voted absentee in the May primary, do they have to request a second absentee ballot for the August primary election? And the answer is yes. You're gonna have to go through the whole process over again of requesting this absentee ballot. Absentee ballot requests cannot be submitted online. They must be printed out, signed, and mailed to the Board of Elections. If you're talking to someone about voting in November, the Secretary of State's office will mail out absentee ballot request forms to all registered voters sometime in September. So you won't have to worry about getting that request form, although you'll still have to send it in, fill it out, either in person or in the mail. Does anybody have questions about requesting an absentee ballot? This is what the form looks like. So if we're talking about the August election, on section 6, you're going to want to have the voter mark primary election, because they're going to need to request either a Republican or a Democrat ballot. I don't think there's going to be an issues only ballot in Franklin County for them to pick from. So they'll need to mark that primary election. And then for section 4, the voter can have the ballot mailed to any address that they choose. They can choose to have it mailed out of state if they know they're going to be on vacation, if they're going to be in California for the month of July and they want to vote absentee, they can have it mailed anywhere, really. And then make sure that they sign it and they put in today's date. So this is a little program that I like to push for people that are voting absentee. In Ohio, you can look up where your absentee ballot is in the system. It's a little bit like tracking an Amazon package. So once you've requested your absentee ballot, you will get a text or email on when the absentee ballot application is received by the Board of Elections, a second notification when the absentee ballot is mailed back to you, and a third when your completed absentee ballot is received back at the Board of Elections. So that can ease some voters' minds because there is a lot of back and forth when it comes to voting absentee. With this program, you do have to go online and sign up for it. It's not automatic. So there is a link here, and I will send out these slides afterwards so that you have all this information. But you do have to go on the Franklin County Board of Elections website and affirmatively sign up for this program. But I've done this several times and it works really well. I get text messages whenever my ballot's moved on to the next stage. And it's just nice to know that where it is in the process and once it's actually been counted. So, okay, any questions about absentee ballots at all? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what's on the ballot coming up in August. Because Ohio has had various legislative maps drawn and rejected by the Ohio Supreme Court and redrawn and re-rejected by the Ohio Supreme Court, we are having a second primary election now that we finally have a map in place for 2022 for the Ohio Senate and the Ohio House. Now this map, try to think of a good way to say this. This map was formally put in place by federal judges in the Sixth Circuit, and it is only valid for the 2022 election. So the maps are still in litigation. They're still being contested. We don't know what kind of maps we're going to have for 2024, but for this year, this is what we've got. The Franklin County Board of Elections just today released the list of candidates that have filed to run in the August 2nd election. In Franklin County, there are no contested Ohio Senate races. There are, however, contested House races. Based on my calculation of looking at the forms today, it looks like House District 1, 2, 3, 6, and 9 Democrats have contested primary elections, and House Districts 4, 10, and 11 have Republican contested elections. There are 4 liquor permits issues on the ballot, but there's no like substantive levies or issues on the ballot. The other item that some voters may be voting on will be the State Central Committee members, and the State Central Committee is the governing body of the Ohio Republican or the Ohio Democrat Party. So depending on where you live in Ohio, you may or may not have anything to vote on. I think when I looked up my districts, I was not in a contested House district. I don't think, and I don't think I was in one of the contested State Central Committee districts either. We get quite a few questions on primary elections. What does that mean? Why do I have to request one party or another party's ballot? What does that mean in terms of my political party affiliation? So in Ohio, you don't have to be what some consider a registered Republican or a registered Democrat in order to vote in that party's primary election. You choose the party ballot that you wish to vote on election day or when you're requesting your absentee ballot. And you can switch your request or switch parties every time that there's a primary election. So you're not obligated to vote for any particular party whenever there's a different primary election. So for example, if I voted a Republican ballot on the May primary, I can now choose to vote a Democrat ballot for the August election. So this year is especially strange because you can kind of vote in both parties a little bit if you want to. Whereas normally when we only have one primary, you would be limited to just voting Democrats or just voting for Republicans. And when there are issues on the ballot, you can select an issues only ballot. However, like we talked a little bit about before, there will be very few, if any, issues on the ballot. So most voters will not have the choice to vote an issues only ballot. Okay. I wanted to include a little bit of information about the November 8th general election because most voters, I would say the general public in Ohio is not overly aware that there is an August 2nd primary election coming up. Some voters won't have anything to vote on anyways. Most people will be focused on the November 8th general election. So the voter registration deadline for that election is October 10th. We'll be voting on a whole bunch of different races: governor, US Senate, the US House of Representatives, the Ohio legislature. We already know that there's going to be 2 statewide ballot issues. Both are congressional. I'm sorry, it says congressional amendment, but I meant to say constitutional amendment. So they're both constitutional amendments. The first states that citizenship is a requirement for voting. And the second is determining bail amount based on public safety concerns. So we don't yet have the specific ballot language for either of these constitutional amendments. So we once we get those specific languages, we can analyze them a little bit more. I will let you all know that on preliminary inspection, the League of Women Voters is against both of these amendments. But we haven't had a chance to actually look at the specific language yet. And when you're doing voter registration for the League or any other nonprofit, you'll want to be nonpartisan, and we never encourage or discourage people from voting any particular way on issues or candidates. But just to give you all kind of a heads up on what we're looking for November. Okay. So now wanted to talk just briefly about, if you do a voter registration drive with the League of Women Voters, what can you expect to get in terms of materials? We have a number of different hard copy forms you'll get. You'll of course get the voter registration forms and the absentee ballot request forms. We have a lot of other material that are palm cards or postcard size. And that has information on the ways to vote, how to get information on candidates, important voter links. We have specific hard copy information on voting with felony convictions, if you voting with disabilities, on election protections. We have various QR codes. The 2 most popular ones right now are for looking at voter registration, and also there's a QR code that can take you to look up your legislative districts for 2022. And we also have both an online and a hard copy voter guide. The online version is at vote411.org. Right now, there's not anything because I don't have the August information up there yet. But that is a nonpartisan candidate and issue guide based on a voter-specific address that has information on the candidates and where they stand on various issues in their own wards. Okay, so this is an example of one of our palm cards. This is our kind of general, it's called Power the Vote, but it has information on how to register to vote, on ID requirements, the different ways to vote, It talks about Vote 411, election protection. It talks about where to find information on judicial candidates, and also where to go to, check your voter registration online and do various other things at the Secretary of State's website. Election protection is a resource that we especially push during even-yeared elections, when voting can be a little bit more contested, when we expect there may be some issues with contested elections and voters not being allowed to vote. Election protection is a 1-800 number where you can call or text if you have a problem voting. This is a nationwide number. It's staffed by election protection lawyers. They compile complaints to see where the problems are and what problems what the problems are and where they are arising from. They also help voters work through any problems in the moment. This is a really great resource that we really want to push this year, when we expect that there might be some problems with voters not being able to vote, or misinformation, disinformation about elections. One of the best things about this number is that it is available in multiple languages. So it's not just English and Spanish. It's I can't think of everything off the top of my head, but I think there's about 10 different languages that it supports. Okay, so tips for voter outreach. If you are doing a League of Women Voters event and it's your first time and you're a first-time volunteer, I will try to match you up with a more experienced volunteer that can help you out during the event, kind of teach you the tips and the tricks. But just be friendly and outgoing. We like to start our interactions with voters with the question, have you checked your voter registration lately? Because most people have not. And that seems to be a better in than asking, are you registered to vote? Because most people will say yes and just move on. It's really, really important that we, the League of Women Voters, be nonpartisan when we're doing voter registration. So we want everyone to be registered to vote, even if you can tell when you're registering this person that they do not agree with anything that you agree, and you will be voting for the completely opposite things. We believe that democracy works when everyone who's eligible is registered to vote and everyone is voting. So please keep that in mind. Also, please don't wear t-shirts or hats or buttons that endorse any particular candidates or issues when you're at one of our voter outreach events. For those of you who haven't done a lot of voter outreach before, oftentimes at our events, we do not register. I'll say maybe we register 5 to 10 voters, and that sounds like hardly anything. But a brief encounter with a voter may spark them to take action at a later date. So a lot of what we're doing is not just voter registration, but also getting people to think about how to be an informed voter, where to go to find information about candidates, answering their questions about how do I vote absentee, talking to them about upcoming elections. If you do outreach this summer, many people will say, oh, I didn't know there was an election in August. So, a lot of it is just interacting with the public, making sure that they're aware that there is an election coming up and that they are voting, and they're telling their friends and their families. And finally, you don't have to know everything as a voter registration and outreach volunteer. It's totally fine to say you don't know. And I've been getting very used to saying I don't know this year, because we have had such a crazy, unprecedented election year so far that often the correct answer is we don't know. We don't know yet. When it comes to, for a long time, we didn't know what the maps were going to look like. We didn't know when this second primary election was going to be. So I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer. So that's about all I had. I will follow up with the slides and some links, and then of course some volunteer opportunities. I am gonna stop sharing now and probably stop recording, and then if you all have questions, we will go from there.
Okay.